All right, well, I see that people are still coming into the webinar, but we're going to get started because there's a lot to talk about today. I'm Eric Langenbacher. I'm a senior fellow and the director of the Society, Culture, and Politics program here at the American German Institute. And I'm really pleased to welcome you this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are, to our webinar commemorating the 75th anniversary of the founding of the German Democratic Republic. October 7th is now a very fraught date. There are other dates in German or American history that have taken on different layers of meaning. I'm thinking of November 9th in this regard, but October 7th is not just the anniversary of the founding of the GDR, but it is also the one-year anniversary this year of the horrible Hamas attacks on Israel, which has unleashed just so much in that region. Just for the viewers out there, the American German Institute, along with Georgetown University, will be doing an event on U.S.-German-Israeli relations since October 7th, which will be on October 31st on Georgetown's campus. So please check your email for more details about that event. Today, we're going to look to the past. We're going to talk about the meaning and the history of the German Democratic Republic. And we have three terrific, well-published scholars in the field who will be speaking. Once they finish, we will have time for a question and answer period. I would ask all of our attendees to please type your questions into the Q&A function or the chat that you will see at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Then I will probably collect some questions, read the questions off. I can, connect different similar questions. So that's how we'll do it once our three speakers have finished. We're going to start with Mary Fulbrook, who's a professor of German history at the University College London. Then she will be talking about milestones of the German Democratic Republic. Then we'll hear from Julie Ault, who will be talking, among other things, about the GDR's environmental legacy. And then we'll have Andrew Port, who will talk about Ostalgie, and other dimensions of GDR memory. So, Dr. Fulbrook, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I was slightly bemused by the significance of the date, thinking of the 7th of October, when the news is just full of the Hamas attack. But I want to focus particularly on, I was given the task of milestones, and actually with a typo, I'm adding in an L and calling it millstones. In terms of a rather different approach to GDR history from the normal one, I think we're all very, very familiar with the milestones of GDR history. You wouldn't be here in the audience if you weren't already well versed in the foundation, the building of the wall, the change from Ulbricht to Honecker, the decline from the late 1970s through the 80s, environmental damage, and then finally, of course, the revolutionary events of 1989 and ultimately the collapse of communist rule. So I don't want to focus on those very obvious things which we, I think, all know about. I want to look at it from a slightly different perspective. And this comes in part from the way my own research trajectory has developed. I think this is a missing dimension of GDR history. And I'll talk you through in three quick sections. First of all, overall interpretations and approaches to the GDR. Secondly, and this is the dimension that I think is missing, the legacies of the Nazi past. And thirdly, what this missing dimension means for how we think about what questions we may want to ask about the GDR. So let me just put some quite abstract points to start with in terms of overall approaches. The history of the GDR has quite understandably primarily been approached through the lens of communist dictatorships and the changing character of actually existing socialism, with a continuing tendency to analyse the GDR in terms of a state versus society paradigm. And although we've moved beyond the great clashes, the controversies, particularly of the 1990s around totalitarianism, versus those historians who wanted to find modes of accommodation and limited spaces for the exercise of agency, I think we are still experiencing difficulty, in part for political reasons, in being able to tell both sides of the story simultaneously, being able to put together the story of repression, the Stasi, the wall, and the story of accommodation, perfectly normal lives, as so many East Germans put it to me. I, in fact, wrote The People's State in part as a response to the way in which so many East Germans said to me, ja, ich habe ein ganz normales Leben gehabt. I had a quite perfectly normal life. So these two parts are very difficult to put together in one story. But the point I want to make here is something much bigger than that, or quite different from that, if I may. I can hear somebody talking. Can somebody mute who's got their sound on? I don't know if that's bothering other people. It's certainly bothering me slightly. Interpretations of the GDR tend to be synchronic, focusing on negotiations of power and conflicting interests in an ever-changing present. So two things at the same time. And sometimes there are comparisons with West Germany in negative terms, economy not as good as the West German economic miracle, or comparisons backwards, dictatorships, long debates about to compare is not to say they're the same, similarities with the Third Reich and so on. And I think what has been missing from many approaches is what I would call a diachronic interpretation of the GDR as what I would call a post-Nazi society. And this is much more complex than you might think. So let me turn secondly then to some of the legacies of the Nazi past and the post-war era, and first of all, the obvious legacies, and what this implied for the nature of the East German dictatorship. The GDR, most obviously, was brought into being by and ruled under the aegis of the communist power that had previously been its mortal enemy in the Barbarossa campaign that Hitler fought against the Soviet Union. This was posed as an existential battle of Germans against Judeo-Bolshevism, that only one power could survive, the Soviets or the Germans. And the GDR was clear evidence to its population of having lost that battle. It was followed by the horrific experiences of rapes and robberies by members of the Red Army at the end of the war. And these, both the prior mindset and the experiences, gave the GDR a distinctive starting point, which I think has to be borne in mind when looking at the subsequent history. I think along with that is the fact, and this has only become more and more clear to me as I've been working on Nazi Germany and complicity in the Holocaust, very large numbers of Germans had in fact either conformed under Hitler's rule or become more actively complicit in one way or another in the Nazi regime. So to turn former supporters or beneficiaries of Nazism into supposedly committed socialist citizens of the GDR within a matter of 2 or 3 decades would be a dramatic transformation. The other quite obvious points about the GDR have to do with the nature of the communist founding fathers. They officially styled the state the anti-fascist state. They officially claimed that Nazis had fled west, but the communist founding fathers had experienced in their own bodies, in their own families, in their own lives, the devastating consequences of Nazi rule. And this gave a particularly paranoid flavour to their suppression of any other opinions, including liberal and democratic views. And the suppression of pro-democratic liberal views was, in this view, a form of collateral damage, as one might say. The prospect of allowing any anti-communist free rein to agitate was for them unbearable. So this, as you all know, legitimated a radical restructuring of political, social, and economic structures and a radical turnover of personnel in key areas, and a radical transformation in ideology and education, including memorial practices, emphasizing anti-fascist resistance, while the Jewish victims of Nazi persecution were downgraded as having been essentially passive second-class victims, barely memorialized. Now, all of this, as I said, is well known. What I want to get at is the really interesting feature, it seems to me, of exploring the significance of this for people's inner views and outer behaviours, my third point that I want to make. In the official myth about the innocent peasants and workers, as they were alleged to be, the vast majority of East Germans were effectively exonerated. The lack of a genuine public sphere meant that it was easier to draw a veil of silence over former involvement in Nazism. But when I started working on the records of post-war justice, including the records of trials in the GDR compared to trials, court proceedings in West Germany for a more recent book, Reckonings, I suddenly realized just how much was missing from essentially synchronic accounts of GDR, which pose the population of East Germans as innocent victims of a new dictatorship. An awful lot of people, as I said, had been complicit and implicated in the Nazi regime and its crimes. During the first decade and a half after the war, while uncertainty persisted about how long division might last, many people did consider flight to the West. And the so-called 1929ers, the generation born from the mid-20s to the early 30s, had enormous structurally given opportunities for rapid advancement. What I think we're less well aware of is how many East Germans with compromised backgrounds under Nazism then accommodated themselves to communist expectations and were also rewarded with enhanced responsibilities and promotions and honorific awards for societal commitment. And when we start looking at court cases in the 1950s, many of the smaller cases being just quietly terminated and not pursued, it's quite evident that in every little village and every community across the GDR, there were people who had participated in Kristallnacht, who had benefited from the expropriation and exclusion of Jews, who had been over into Poland doing unspeakable things in the persecution of the Jews in Poland, who had committed offences against former forced labourers, and many of them then just had their proceedings quietly terminated in the 1950s. But when we look then also at what historians look at, the records of attitudes and opinions, the grumbling, the dislike of the GDR that comes across in many reports, opinion reports, but also even apparent enthusiasm and conformity, we have to ask ourselves, where were these people coming from? Were they over-conforming in order to cover a Nazi past? Were they grumbling not because they were good Democrats and didn't like dictatorship, but because they were good former Nazis and didn't like communism? We have to reinterpret these opinion and attitude reports in light of this past. And I just want to take a couple of late trials as examples to indicate just what the wider implications are. And a particular local case study that I just want to raise to your attention. There's a small community called Gransee, which is north of Berlin, just south of the former concentration camp of Ravensbrück. And in Gransee, I went there poking around in part because some relatives of my half-brother had lived there and had been forced they were deported and ultimately killed by the Nazis. And I went to look at the Stolpersteine that had been laid in their former place of residence. Hard to find. I was quite struck that the local Gransee Museum had a lot about the long prehistory of this little community. It's a beautiful, perfectly maintained, more or less medieval town within its old medieval town walls, not bombed. The museum jumped from the Weimar period to the GDR with a lot of very interesting exhibits, but nothing on Nazism. I asked the curator what's going on there, and he said, no, well, we don't really cover that period. I wandered around the place and found a plaque on a wall to a family that on Kristallnacht had been forced out of their house. Their possessions had been thrown out of the windows. They'd been set on fire, and the family were eventually deported and disappeared like my half-brothers' relatives. But there's precious little memorialization in this place. And yet, this is the really interesting case. A late trial in the GDR in 1983 was a man called Heinz Barth, who was a perpetrator involved in that very well-known Oradour-sur-Glane massacre in France, where there is a totally demolished village. Some of you may know the ruins have been preserved as a memorial. And he was brought to court while his superior who'd ordered the massacre, General Heinz Lammerding, was living freely in West Germany, despite having authorized the massacre and despite having been sentenced to death in absentia in France in 1953. And this is the really interesting thing to me about this story of Heinz Barth. Heinz Barth had lived happily as a teenager in Gransee. He'd been a committed Nazi in the 1930s. He'd probably participated in the bonfire of that Jewish family's possessions in 1938. And then after the war, he'd gone back to Gransee and lived there under his own name, no attempt to disguise his identity, and as a loyal GDR citizen. Playing a role in all the local cooperative and organizations and so on, like many other loyal GDR citizens that historians like us might get very exercised about how do we evaluate their positive opinions, and was this really support for communism, so on. And then, ironically, his Nazi past only came to light accidentally because his son, who had brought up to be an equally loyal GDR citizen, had volunteered for service on the inner German border. This required a high level of security clearance, and the Stasi checked into the family background, discovered who Heinz Barth was. So that's one case. A very similar case of a former significant Nazi perpetrator who lived quietly under his own name for decades in the post-war GDR is that of SS Obersturmführer Henry Schmidt, a former Gestapo officer who had overseen deportations from Dresden to Theresienstadt and Auschwitz. He was put on trial as late as 1987 in Dresden. He too had led a model life as a committed GDR citizen. He'd raised a family, he'd participated in mass organizations, he'd gained all the honors and awards for work. He too had made no effort to disguise his former identity, although Schmidt, it has to be said, is not a terribly unusual name, continued to live under his own name. And his children too had grown up apparently totally unencumbered and apparently unaware of the parental perpetrator past. So I'm just giving you these as tips of the iceberg. There are innumerable other cases. Many of them did not come to court. Some of them have only come out recently where people have poked into their background. I just want to raise the question about these. They're distinctive in their individual details, but they're highly suggestive of the way in which large numbers of former Nazis could transform themselves into seemingly model, committed East German citizens and lead apparently unremarkable lives, with their children becoming conformist citizens. So let me just conclude about what this post-Nazi slant might lead us to ask about the GDR. I think they lend a different gloss to overall interpretations and leave us with at least a couple of wider questions. One, to my mind, is that of how easily people can adapt to living in and through quite different dictatorships. And it raises the question, had characters like Heinz Barth, committed Nazi in the 1930s, perpetrator in the 1940s, committed GDR citizen from 49 onwards, as far as we can tell, and Henry Schmidt and innumerable others, were they simply willing to serve under any kind of regime, irrespective of political ideology? We know of people who turned Nazi in 1933 after having been communists and socialists prior to that. The people who, so-called beefsteak Nazis, brown on the outside with their brown shirts on, red on the inside. Can people change their colours so quickly? And what were the implications for their children and the subsequent generation? We know from books like Ines Geipel's recent books that the grandfather, a Nazi involved in massacres at Riga, the father, a very senior Stasi figure, she, a committed athlete until she finally challenged the regime and escaped to the West. We know that there is some incredible ricocheting going on with unspoken transmission of the legacies, perhaps in physical or emotional abuse rather than actually narrative. So this is a really aspect of GDR history that I think needs far more research. Um, and those who were grumbling, who are registered in official opinion reports as hostile negative or uncertain wavering, these are the standard GDR terminologies, were they former Nazis? Those who were making positive comments? You know, how do we write this into our understanding of the two succeeding dictatorships diachronically, as well as the kind of synchronic explorations we've had? It raises also the question of the ease of personal narratives in rewriting and reinterpreting the past after 1933, after 1945, and again after 1990, which I think will feed into some of what Andrew may want to talk about in terms of nostalgia in the 35 years since reunification. And I think in terms of how we view today, my final question that this raises, I don't think it's appropriate, as so much memorialization does, to view East German citizens still within the sort of synchronic framework of, in terms of being either collaborators or victims of a repressive regime, as so much of the memorial activity seems to want to make the framework, but rather we need to weave in diachronically more complex approaches to historical legacies and changes over time, and combine approaches to changing subjectivities with the outer and more visible milestones of the history with which we're so familiar: the wall, the Stasi, the economic shortages, the political constraints. So I look forward very much to the other contributions and to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, next up is Dr. Ault, who's at the Department of History at the University of Utah.
Hi, thank you, Eric, for inviting me to be a part of this, and it's an honor to be participating with Mary and with Andrew. In preparing, I'm going to start my timer to keep a track of myself from wandering off too much. In preparing for this conversation, I went back and listened to the American German Institute's webinar on the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Federal Republic from May. And part of what stood out to me with that conversation was how much the commentators, contributors debated the success narrative of the Federal Republic. And since this is about the founding of the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, the conversation could very easily turn into a discussion of East Germany as the failed post-war German state. And on some level, that's absolutely undebatable. The GDR does not exist anymore. Certainly from my own research perspective, the GDR left innumerable environmental failures in its wake. And of course, the Federal Republic continues today, and as I'll come back to later, contributed significantly to the cleanup of the economic and environmental challenges that the GDR left behind. Still, despite that, I would like to, in the next few minutes, challenge or complicate the idea of the GDR as simply a failed state. And I want to do that by looking at the GDR in terms of two particular frames of reference. The first, of course, is obviously the GDR sense of competition and relationship with West Germany, with the Federal Republic, that we see it as a failure. But of course, the GDR very much exceeded in some ways expectations for regrowth and economic productivity after World War II. I'll come back to that in a minute. But also, I want to look at the GDR in the context of Eastern Europe and the Soviet bloc more broadly. And if you look at the GDR from both East and West, it actually represented a unique confluence of influences and competing interests. In a sense, it was a physical and environmental hinge between East and West, between the two blocs, between two systems. And thus, rather than treating the GDR as an isolated, failed state cut off from the rest of the world behind the Iron Curtain. I'd argue instead that in many ways it was a point of connection. And there's been a lot of work on this in recent years, sort of the porousness of the Iron Curtain. I'd like to particularly look at that through through looking at shared physical environments, as well as related politics and protest in sort of green politics in post-war Germany's and post-war Europe more broadly. Pollution, people, ideas, and data all crossed the GDR's seemingly impenetrable and highly militarized borders. And I want to emphasize that the GDR's borders to Eastern Europe, to Poland, and to Czechoslovakia were also quite militarized, although not, of course, as much as the Iron Curtain. Um, and these dynamics of interconnection as well as militarized borders influenced and shaped the debates about East Germany, and also, of course, after unification in 1990 as well. So East Germany was a highly industrialized economy from the get-go, from the founding, right? In competition with the larger West German state, each trying to present themselves as the better Germany, with the anti-fascist legacy in the East German case, or the democratic alternative to Nazi Germany, sort of as Mary Fulbrook was just talking about. Um, but East Germany is very much challenged by being smaller, by being a dictatorship that lacked much um, domestic popularity, and certainly through seeing the outmigration of people through the 53 uprising, etc. And also through West German policy, thinking, of course, about the Hallstein Doctrine, and the GDR's lack of international recognition, right? The basically having to choose which Germany you would recognize. And so for the communist leaders in East Germany, economic production output was very much an important part of trying to claim legitimacy as a communist state, but also as a success narrative after the Nazi dictatorship. And so um, what we see here then for East Germany is this hinge between East and West. Well, the GDR is not in many ways keeping up with the economic miracle of the West. It is actually much more successful than most of the countries of Eastern Europe. It had higher standards of living, was more highly industrialized, was producing more goods that were sold both within the Soviet bloc and other communist states, as well as beyond it. And a large part of the GDR's economic successes, such as they were, right? It's all relative here, whether you look to the East or the West. A lot of this was based on extensive mining and industrial production. East Germany was heavily reliant on brown coal or lignite to fuel its economy. And its economy, well, of course, there are many, many sectors to it. Among its most prestigious and prized economic sectors were the chemical industry, based in particular around Bitterfeld, as well as sort of Leuna and Buna and places like this. And that sort of brings me back to the environmental point here, right? Is that this industrial production and economic output, the regrowth after World War II, was in large part also a huge environmental problem. There was extensive pollution for water and air quality, and stemming from these issues, of course, then were public health considerations. In Bitterfeld, for example, um, residents experienced higher rates of respiratory illnesses, birth defects, and more. And in 1968, there's actually a prognosis report created by the SED. It's one of many prognosis reports, is sort of assessing the economy, but there's one in particular about environmental issues. And in that report, they acknowledge the negative impact of pollution on industrial production. So the East German economy and the East German leaders understood that the pollution they were creating was in fact having detrimental effects on people, on the economy, on any number of other related issues. And in the 1970s, there are then efforts somewhat limited, certainly in their success, at regulating the environmental pollution that the East German economy produced. Now, part of the problem here is, of course, you have both a regulator and the polluter being the same entity, essentially, in the state, just sort of two different parts of the same entity. And so this was not very successful. And there's increasing frustration and protest around both environmental conditions on the one hand in the late 70s and into the 1980s, but also about information politics, right? The restricting of access to that environmental data, right? This is part of the functioning of the dictatorship, is to hide what doesn't look good, um, glowingly upon the state, right? Doesn't reflect well upon it. Um, but these environmental issues, and part of this hinge between East and West that I'm trying to make an argument for the GDR being, is that the GDR was both affected by pollution in other states as well as its pollution then having an impact on its neighbors. So, for example, in northern Bohemia and Czechoslovakia, also, this is a large coal mining area. There's a lot of pollution that results in acid rain and creates Waldsterben, or the dying of the forests in the Erzgebirge, in Germany, East Germany, in the GDR along the Czechoslovak border. But pollution from the GDR is then also air pollution flowing eastward into Poland and creating acid rain and Waldsterben in Poland, right? So you see this connection of industrial production, pollution, and problems. And the GDR actually is very resistant to any sort of polluter pays model because it doesn't want to have to pay out money to Poland in the late 1980s. Um, but of course, the GDR's connections to West Germany are undeniable as well. Overwhelmingly, water pollution from the GDR, runoff from the chemical industry, etc., flowed westward into West German rivers and waterways, such as the Elbe, or as Astrid Eckert has talked about, with pollution from potash mining crossing the East German border into West Germany. So the GDR is connected in many different ways here, physically as well as environmentally. And this, of course, creates challenges for unification, trying to jump forward here a little bit towards the legacies that Eric suggested I would be talking about here. And this is one of the big challenges of unification, along with questions of human rights and reunifications and what laws to adopt, is also how to handle the GDR's failing economy as well as its devastating environmental pollution, which the full extent of which was not really known until 1990. And what we see then in the 1990s is that Helmut Kohl promises blühende Landschaften, right, the blooming landscapes. Um, and this is actually the case for the former GDR in the 90s. The air is cleaner, the water is cleaner. There's an extensive investment by the Federal Republic as well as others to clean up the economic or the environmental pollution of the GDR. However, that is in some ways overshadowed by new challenges of the former East Germany becoming part of a more globalized, competitive capitalist market where some regions are left out. You have high rates of unemployment, outmigration from places such as Bitterfeld. And so you see the GDR, or former GDR now, is grappling with a better environment, but human tolls on some of the implications or consequences of privatization. And there's plenty to say about Troy Hunt and all of that that I'll skip over right now. But fundamentally, the GDR becoming, or former GDR, becoming part of a more globalized economy. That said, if we keep thinking about the former GDR as a hinge between East and West, we see a lot of challenges in the GDR relative to West Germany, or now the Federal Republic, the former West Germany. But the GDR experiences a much wealthier and more stable 1990s than many of the rest of the Soviet bloc, in large part because of its support from the Federal Republic. Poland, for example, right, goes through austerity and rapid privatization and has a lot of uncertainty in the 1990s, which in some ways the former GDR doesn't experience to the same extent. So just to conclude here briefly, I've laid out a series of things that hopefully make some sense, but what I hopefully you'll be able to come away with is the idea that the GDR was a small Cold War state that was in competition with the West, but I would argue that it was actually central to larger European and even global questions about production, consumption, and environmental impacts, and what John McNeill has referred to as the Great Acceleration, sort of an environmental history about the expansion of these things since World War II. And rather than viewing the GDR as a failed Cold War oddity, I'd argue that in many ways the GDR is reflective of many post-war global transformations. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. All right. And last but not least, we have Dr. Port from the Department of History at Wayne State University.
Okay. Eric, Jack, thank you so much for organizing this. I'm very happy to be here. When I first entered the East German archives 30 years ago to conduct research for my dissertation, it was at a time when much of the world seemed to believe that the good guys had won the Cold War, that with the victory of liberal democracy and the free market, the end of history had finally arrived. An elderly German woman I met working at a coat check in Potsdam in the spring of 1990 told me as much when we began to chat about what life had been like for her in the GDR. 40 years wasted, she bitterly complained, adding that she'd been forced to take her current job at the coat check after retiring from decades of factory work because her state pension was so meager. This was not what I wanted to hear back then, and it's not the type of vignette one finds in Katja Heuer's new best-selling book, Beyond the Wall, A History of East Germany, which begins almost every section with a short, usually upbeat life story about the experiences of an ordinary East German. Irritated by the staggering degree of Western triumphalism so pervasive at the time, I had planned to write a dissertation about the more positive aspects of life in the former Soviet satellite, that is, about the forgotten or ignored sunny side of state socialism. Well, I never wrote that book, mainly because the picture that emerged from the archives about real existing socialism, based primarily on verbatim remarks by East Germans when their state still existed, it quickly disabused me of pursuing my, in retrospect, naive enterprise. Well, Heuer now has written that book 30 years later, and her challenge to Western smugness, that's a quote, and hubris have earned profuse praise in the American and especially British media. And in the time I have today, I'd like to explore that over-the-top reception and, more important, the factors fueling it, even in some of the Anglophone world's most conservative media outlets. Now, reviewers have outdone one another in expressing their admiration for this, and this is all quotes, extraordinary, enthralling, engrossing, and erudite book. And it's really worth citing their precise locution in order to get a sense of just how effusive the praise has been. Beyond the Wall is rich and powerful, brilliant and compelling, fascinating and incisive. What makes this superlative book so necessary and important is its illuminating insights and judicious approach, its impressive, commanding, exhaustive, and rich attention to detail. Who knew that Stasi Chief Erich Mielke preferred, quote, 2 eggs boiled for 4.5 minutes, pierced beforehand for breakfast? Well, for all these reasons, we are told by the reviewers, this much-needed book offers a bracing corrective to the usual Cold War caricatures and should be required reading in Germany, where, incidentally, its critical reception has been much less enthusiastic. By asking additional questions and providing new answers, it is myth-busting and counterintuitive, eye-opening, and enormously refreshing. In short, Heuer's first-of-its-kind history is the definitive history of the GDR, quote, history at its best, according to the judges of the Bell Gifford Prize, the UK's premier annual prize, according to its website, for nonfiction books. Its highly acclaimed author is, others tell us, rapidly emerging as one of the finest historians writing today. The 21st century has found, it would seem, its new E.P. Thompson or Fernand Braudel. According to the reviewers, few of whom, it's worth noting, have published anything themselves about East German history or ever even seen this inside of a GDR archive, the story of the failed socialist state has been either mistold or all too often dismissed as a freak accident of the Cold War, a totalitarian blip that met its rightful downfall. by combating amnesia and the aggressive junking of the GDR past, again, when I kind of raise my eyes and inflect, those are quotes, by combating amnesia and the aggressive junking of the GDR past, we are told Hoyer has single-handedly, and rather paternalistically, I might add, rescued the supposedly drab GDR from the condescension of history. In so doing, she has restored agency and dignity to East Germans, as well as some honor and fairness to the historical record. In short, Hoya has upended what she and most of her reviewers see as the prevailing image of the now defunct GDR as a walled-in, Russian-controlled Stasi land, whose citizens suffered from constant surveillance and intimidation. No, this was a place where people, quote, shaped their own destinies and lived lives in full color, a far cry from the gray, monotonous blur conjured by the Western imagination. East Germans lived, loved, worked, and grew old, we learn in a frequently cited passage from the book's preface. Quote, they went on holidays, made jokes about their politicians, and raised their children. Now, forget the fact that those of us familiar with the mountain of scholarly literature on the GDR produced since 1990, as well as those of us who had ever read, say, Milan Kundera's wonderful novels about socialist Czechoslovakia, forget the fact that we already knew that. No, hang on to your hats and, quote, forget everything you thought you knew about life in the GDR, because this colorful history is full of surprises. Actually, this is me speaking now, it's full of cliches, though in its better moments, it repeats what professional historians have been claiming for decades, but with nary a nod to those historians and their work. Katja Hoyer has single-handedly reinvented the wheel, she and her reviewers would have you believe. To make the case, they emphasize the supposedly forgotten positive aspects of life in former East Germany, focusing, of course, on the usual suspects: inexpensive goods and housing, social mobility, and female emancipation. But this is, of course, only half the story. What they fail to mention is the miserable state of the housing stock, say, or, with an eye to women, their underrepresentation in positions of leadership, endemic sexism at the workplace, chronic shortages of child care spots, or the fact that female contract workers from places like Vietnam and Mozambique faced either deportation or abortion if they became pregnant. Instead, the focus is on the many opportunities for socioeconomic advance in the GDR and, quote, engine of social mobility for women and those from lower class backgrounds. Almost every review mentions the possibilities the working classes had for university study, which elevated them to leadership positions in the upper echelon society. True, but again, what they do not touch on is how access to higher education was contingent on ideological conformity, or how the children of the socially and politically incorrect suffered systematic discrimination. Riding roughshod over the stories of those who had less pleasant experiences, the reviewers focus instead on the remarkable progress the regime supposedly made on a host of social and economic fronts: the less stressful lifestyle and lack of commercialism, the sense of collective identity, whatever that means, the appeal of a genuinely anti-fascist socialist Germany so shortly after the demise of the Nazis. Excuse me. This was why most East Germans supposedly developed a sense of attachment to the GDR, a strong feeling of genuine pride, popular joy, approval, and even admiration of their country's many triumphs and achievements, not least, wait for it, of course, in the world of international sports. Most of Hoyer's interviewees told her, in fact, that they were indeed, quote, quite happy before the wall fell, and that they missed the simplicity of the GDR, where life was quite pleasant and relatively comfortable, where people liked their jobs and felt content, where they got by and had nothing to worry about. After all, one woman told her, nobody worried about where their next meal would come from, and friends weren't trying to one-up each other with shiny acquisitions, end quote. I remember when I did interviews 30 years ago, I was often told that when they heard that I was from New York, they would say, well, things weren't perfect by us, but at least, nobody slept under a bridge. Also true. Well, one can only wonder, given this effusive praise, one can only wonder why anyone wished to leave the GDR, or why the vast majority celebrated the fall of the wall in 1989, and then overwhelmingly voted for unification in 1990. Confirming all of this, one reviewer talks about family members he met after the wall fell. Quote, I found them to be generally more modest and self-effacing than those of us raised in the more competitive and individualistic societies to the West. Well, no surprise, given that the West was, quote, stiflingly conformist and, quote, infested with Nazis. Cliche upon cliche, then, without any sense of the more recent and more nuanced historical studies that have appeared since 1990, with one set of platitudes replacing ones common during the Cold War and supposedly since unification. Even when it comes to the invidious activities of the Stasi, we are told the West should not gloat too much. After all, the Federal Republic came close to adopting police state tactics to combat terrorism in the 1970s. Besides, surveillance in the GDR was, and this is a quote from one of the reviews, arguably less intrusive, certainly less effective than today's data plundering techno giants. Now, this last claim, I think, offers a hint about what really seems to be at stake here and why so many reviewers in the English language press have heaped such effusive praise on Hoyer's book. Much of their commentary reveals concern and disappointment about contemporary developments in the post-Cold War world, not just in the former East, but also closer to home in the West. In other words, what really seems to be driving the book's positive reception in much of the English language press is a longing for an alternative to the post-war West's dominant socioeconomic system, to neoliberalism. Beyond the Wall, writes historian Samuel Huneke, one of the few reviewers who has actually published on the history of the GDR, allows us to think, quote, more capaciously about what, if anything, might be worth salvaging from 20th century socialism. After all, there's, quote, something about socialism that East Germans miss, its meaningful and tangible benefits, and, quote, something about neoliberal capitalism that is profoundly alienating. A more serious reckoning with the wreckage of state socialism, a consideration of, quote, where it succeeded as well as where it failed, might help us find our way to a, quote, more utopian future. Now, I am not entirely unsympathetic to such arguments. In fact, I shared similar views before entering the archives in the mid-1990s and before speaking with former East Germans from all walks of life in the months and years following the fall of the wall. And that taught me a great deal about the everyday reality of real existing socialism in the GDR. And what I learned then and since simply doesn't jibe with the East Germany depicted in the glowing reviews of Hoyer's book. I certainly have understanding for the anger and resentment felt by many in the East. Nostalgie came largely in response to the difficulty of adjusting to the exigencies of a liberal market economy, and just as important, to the open disdain and arrogance many Aussies experienced in the wake of unification. Now, however understandable that Trotzreaktion may be, it's worth pointing out that many of the things that are now looked upon wistfully, such as the vaunted Notgemeinschaft, were not necessarily achievements of the regime, but rather responses to the very deficiencies of that regime. Now, those who bristle at Western arrogance, at besserwisserische Wessis pontificating dismissively about life in the GDR without any first or even secondhand knowledge, I've personally witnessed some hair-raising instances over the years, they're not necessarily hankering for Hanukkah or wishing for the wall. Of course, not everything was bad in the GDR, but what is it then that rankles so much about the English language reception of Hoyer's book? For one, it's the wildly excessive encomia that read more like empty praise for a blockbuster Hollywood movie, written for the most part by non-experts whose tendency to accept what Hoyer writes at face value reveals their lack of familiarity with all the serious and nuanced scholarly work produced over the past 3 decades. This is reflected as well in the many false or distorted claims found in the reviews and the glib cliches reminiscent of really the most banal Stammtischgerede, in the character of Western caricatures that have supposedly reigned supreme since the end of the Cold War. Of course, there was more to the now defunct socialist state than death strips and the omnipresent Stasi. But we have long known that, thanks to the hard work of scholars who have spent countless hours in the archives and familiarized themselves with the ever-growing mass of secondary literature. In the end, one wishes for better informed reviewers, especially ones seemingly less motivated by their personal political proclivities. One can gladly wish for a more just and equitable present. But at a time when many in the West fear and lament the return of authoritarian strongmen, sympathetic musings about the sunny side of a failed dictatorship come across as not just naive, but also negligently dangerous. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was quite the intervention. All right, so we can go a little past our 1 p.m. Eastern time deadline. So hopefully we can have about 15 minutes of Q&A. And I see that we already have some questions in there. So I guess there's one for Julie, one for Mary, and I'll put one in for Andrew. And so here's a question about, is there any difference between the environmental damage caused by the GDR and the damage produced by Western capitalistic market states? In short, industrial pollution would appear to be the same, regardless of what type of economy produced it. For Mary, the two questions I'll put together. Do you think the presence of former Gestapo personnel in the Stasi had some effect on the way that the past of others were dealt with or not dealt with? And then also a quick word towards your evidentiary basis. Where are you getting your data for attitudes towards the GDR? And then a question for Andrew, which is coming from me, right? And I really agree with your contrast between the differing receptions to Hoyer's book in the English language press as well as the German press. And I'm wondering if it has something to do with, so if I think about things that the press in the United States and Britain are concerned about these days regarding Germany, it's the state of the economy, and then it's also the AfD, especially because we just had elections in several Eastern states. And so I'm wondering if that is connected somehow to this kind of effusive review of the book that, it's like, oh, now we finally understand why the AfD is so disproportionately strong in the East. It's because East Germans have been dissed and because this, what did you say? The condescension of history has treated them, and this is one way that they are kind of reacting. It's another Trotzreaktion, as you kind of put it. So I'm wondering
That
if
was an
that's
Thompson phrase, by the way, just so I didn't come up with that condescension.
Yeah. All right, so why don't we start with Mary, then Julie, and then Andrew.
So, two questions. One is the presence of former Gestapo personnel in the Stasi, as the questioner says, as Henry Leider revealed, very important book, in fact, a couple of books by Henry Leider. What they did was they checked out which cases could reliably and usefully be brought to trial in order to have a show trial or publicity or whatever, which cases could not reliably be brought to trial, but the people who'd been uncovered could be co-opted, blackmailed, brought into the service of the Stasi in one way or another. And thus a lot of former Nazis could become very useful in Stasi service. I think the wider question was just not wanting the embarrassment of unearthing and uncovering former Nazis in the GDR when it claimed that all Nazis had gone west. And it was an embarrassment when somebody popped up. Bluscher, who you will all know the picture of the little boy in the Warsaw Ghetto with his hands up, and there's a nasty Nazi in the background with a large gun. That guy was a man called Bluscher. He was brought to trial in the 60s when it was greatly embarrassing to the GDR authorities that he'd been uncovered, and they were having to sort of say, well, he'd looked different, he'd had an accident, etc. We didn't know. So, it certainly had an effect. There's no doubt whatsoever about that. The sources question is a really interesting one because for years people said you can't know what people thought in the GDR. Actually, it's the most incredible source basis for opinions and attitudes. And I discovered this in the early 1990s already. I'd been trying to write about the GDR in the 1980s. I'd traveled there a lot. I wanted to know what people felt. I'd been talking to people. When the archives were opened, I could not believe the wealth of material. So there are these things called situation and opinion reports, which were produced not merely for the party, but for all the mass organizations, the trade union organization, the FDGB, for example, the women's organization, the youth organizations. They're in mountains of files. And I remember in 1992, I think it was, I went into the then headquarters of the still existent FDGB, the trade union organisation in Unterdane Linden, and a little archivist came shuffling out of his cave at the back and whispered to me terribly excitedly, you know, in these files we've got reports of strikes in factories, because of course there were supposed to have been no strikes, there was supposed to have been no worker unrest, and he almost conspiratorially was desperate to dump huge mountains of files on my desk to show all this stuff. So once you start poking around there is an enormous amount of material, not least because if you want to control opinion and intervene and control the population, you have to know what they are saying. In my experience of going through the files, they're fascinating for the 50s and 60s. They become more routinized by the 70s and 80s. And Erich Honecker, frankly, didn't want to know what was really going on. He wanted Potemkin villagers. So you have to read the files very carefully. The other fascinating source is the Leipzig Institute for Opinion Research, particularly on youth. And there are many, many sociological surveys that they carried out, which are really also very, very interesting. So I don't think there is a problem with finding out what people were saying. The problem is really interpreting it, both in the light of evaluating the sources and evaluating why they were saying what they were saying in the context they were saying it. So yeah, thank you.
Julie?
Yeah. So I would say yes, in general, there are a lot of similarities in terms of the industrial pollution created by both capitalist societies and socialist societies. And thinking specifically about East and West Germany here, in the 50s, there are a lot of similarities, but what we see is a divergence over time, and that West Germany is more successful in implementing effective regulation for air and water quality. But there are also incentives then for innovation and improvement in industrial processes that help to improve the environmental situation in West Germany, whereas in East Germany, one thing you see is that it remains more heavily reliant on brown coal or lignite, and actually there's a shift away from it. But after the oil crises of the 1970s, the GDR becomes ever more reliant on lignite again. And that you don't see the same improvements in industrial production and factories in the GDR, so that by the 1980s, East German the industry is simply more antiquated, factories are more overworked, and that contributed to making the GDR more polluted over time, along with the less effective or completely ineffective regulation. I will say the other thing in terms of connecting East and West Germany is, of course, that one thing the Federal Republic is doing by the 1980s is selling its waste to East Germany, and because the East Germans want the money, and so they're basically willing to take the waste to Schönberg and to Schöneiche in order to simply profit off of it, because they're desperate for cash. So those are yes, similarities, but then sort of increasing divergence based on innovation and regulation.
Yeah, Eric, thanks for the question. I think you're onto something. I mean, certainly many of the reviews mention the AfD concern about where Germany is going in terms, is it going to remain a democratic country or not? You could be right that they're interested in understanding why East Germans are voting as they are, maybe as a backlash against how they've been treated over the last 30 years. Of course, they could ask the question, well, maybe the way in which the influence of East Germany itself on these people, maybe that has something to do with how they're voting today and their openness to the AfD, which is a I'm opening up a can of worms there, but one could seriously discuss that. I don't know. I read these reviews and I was really shocked that especially Brits, and Mary, maybe you can explain this, but these conservative Brits who just were enamored with this wonderful book, explaining what a fantastic place East Germany had been. And I have a suspicion, which I probably wouldn't put in writing, but I have a suspicion that very impressionistic, but I always have the impression that the Brits were rather what's the word, envious, jealous of the success of West Germany after 45, especially compared to the UK, economic success, etc. And I wonder if by embracing East Germany, it's kind of a backhanded way of criticizing the West Germans. I don't know, it's just a suspicion, but that's what I would say to that.
All right, well, we are rapidly running out of time, so maybe I'll just pose one more of the many questions that we have in here. And this is, so in 1989, Francois Furet proclaimed that the French Revolution was over in the sense that the debates over the merits of the event could now be relegated to history. Have we reached this point in our understanding of the East German past, or will our historical interpretations continue to be biased by political allegiances? Maybe each of you would like to take a stab at that grand kind of question. And let's do it in reverse order, starting with Andrew.
Okay. Well, I don't think political allegiances ever disappear. I mean, they always inform our how we, I mean, we have these claims to objectivity, but there's always this kind of political and moral subtext that influences how we write and how we interpret. So I don't see that going away. I also, there were claims a few years ago by people like Thomas Lindenberg and others that the GDR has now been ausgeforscht. Is there anything left to look at and to examine? And I think as you got a sense today from Julia and Mary's comments, that there certainly are still things to be done. You mentioned the French Revolution. Well, 200 and how many years now later, 250 years later, we're still writing, thick volumes about the French Revolution. So at this point, I guess to me, the interesting question is what direction the study of the GDR will take. And I have absolutely no sense at this point. I wish I did. I'm very curious to see what the younger generation is going to look at in the next few years. Thanks.
Julie?
Yeah, I would echo what Andrew just said in terms of we're always informed, the present always informs our interpretations of the past, and I think it will continue to be politicized in one way or another. What that is will change over time. And I mean, as we've already seen in the last 30 years, waves, as Mary outlined for us, of interpretation of the GDR anyway. In terms of future directions, I think one thing that I'm working on now and sort of hinted at here is placing the GDR in larger geographic and chronological frameworks rather than seeing it in isolation. And that's also what Mary's working on. But yeah, I mean, the future, we don't know. And I am excited to see what future research on the GDR looks like. But naturally, the questions will change. And in some way, the questions of totalitarianism have been ausgeforscht, sure, but we'll find new things to look at, and I think there's still plenty to mine there, if I can make a really bad pun.
And finally, Mary.
Yeah, I sort of want to take a Weberian view that our political interests determine what we research, but then we are able to look at it. I, however, disagree with Max Weber. I think he got it wrong. What I don't like is politicized indictments of particular kinds of scholarship without looking adequately at the nature of the research, the nature of the evidence, the nature of the argument, and just slamming it because they think, oh, this must be a fellow traveller or this must be an apologetics or whatever. I think we have to move beyond that kind of politicisation of GDR history and really try and understand what does the evidence suggest and how can we debate it in a rational and reasonable way for all our understanding of the fact that we are political beings inevitably. And I just want to link that, if I may, very briefly to one of the final commentators in your Q&A, a proud East German who lived in Leipzig from 1951 to 1994. I don't think you need to have lived in a place to be a historian of it. I didn't live in the Third Reich. I didn't live in the Weimar Republic. I didn't live in the 19th century or medieval Germany, but I can still write about these periods. And I think that you get a different view, a different perspective if you're trying to amass an array of evidence and evaluate it from if you're treating your own personal experiences. I did travel a lot in the GDR. I do have personal experiences before the fall of the wall, and I grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust since my mother was a refugee from Nazi Germany. I always feel I have some sense of that in a way that I don't of, let's say, mid-19th century Russia or whatever. But even there, I think the whole point of being a historian is to engage in the historical imagination, to develop empathy and understanding for historical participants, and try and evaluate different viewpoints and construct an argument that will stand up in the light of the available evidence, researched as comprehensively and exhaustively and intelligently as we are capable of. So I think there's more to history than just having lived there. And
All
there's
right,
more to history than politics.
Thank you very much, Mary, Julie, and Andrew, for taking the time to share your thoughts today. I thought this was an incredibly rich webinar. Thank you also to all of our participants who took the time to hear from us. And so I will conclude the webinar and look forward to seeing many of you at upcoming American German Institute events. Bye.